Okay, thanks for waiting, everybody. So this is the last session. As John announced this morning, the idea of the last session is to kind of look forward a little bit. And there are two questions which I believe have been posed to my panelists here, which is, where do you think we'll be in 2020 and where do you think we should be in 2020? So we have four excellent panelists, and I think the order in which they appear in the booklet is completely random. So we're going to follow that order in terms of them speaking. So they're all going to have, I've asked 5 minutes or possibly slightly more than 5 minutes each, but the point is we'll then have a discussion, questions, answers, comments from everyone in the room. If you think the last session was a bit rushed in terms of the ability to ask questions, then feel free to kind of come back to the last session or indeed anything this morning. And any speakers that are still here, I'm sure will be delighted to answer questions. So we have, in order of speaking, Steve Shay, who has worked in both the private sector and the public sector and is currently at Harvard University. Then we have Andrew, so I should say, Adam Cohen unfortunately couldn't make it at the last minute, but I'm very delighted to say they've got Andrew Ure, who is from Google, and then we have Saibh Young from Lloyds Banking Group. So actually, between them, they have an enormous number of users in the UK. So we have two of the biggest digital companies on the panel at the moment. And finally, we're going to go back to Michael Lennard, who you already met this morning from the United Nations. So I'm going to go quickly through the introductions and see if Steve is ready to start, which he is. Steve.
So I'm going to take us from a somewhat different approach than we've done so far and give a little more than an elevator speech of where I think we should go. And the reason I'm going to skip the answer of where I think we're going to be in 2 years is because if you looked at the tape of what I said 2 years ago about U.S. tax reform, you'd know enough not to listen to anything I have to say about the future. I'm going to make the pitch for going beyond digital right away, partly because, and I recognize that politically there are all kinds of issues, and so the thought process I'm going through is whatever happens over the next couple of years is fine. It's going to happen. I actually don't think much is going to happen because I think it's very hard to reach consensus. So I don't think we'll have an interim solution, which is why I think we need to start working on what I think the real problem is. The real problem, from my personal both experience and just observation, is that the paradigm the international tax has been built on has rested on physical presence as a proxy for where income is earned. So I start off with the proposition that income has no geographic location. Income is an attribute of the person. We take all of your relevant expenditures. We then look at the relevant revenues, and whatever the difference is, that's your income. Sometimes you actually lose money, which I think is important. But physical presence existed for years as the measure of what the source country should get, or income was somehow coming from that country, versus what the residence country could get. And the residence country got a very good deal because there was no source tax typically on direct investment if you did not have a permanent establishment. I planned for years based on that, keeping income out of a source country remotely with bricks and mortars businesses. So I've never understood why this is such a different issue for bricks and mortars from digital. And that's my starting point. The US Supreme Court came down with a decision last week that, if you read the support for the decision, is all about why we have to tax remote businesses. It was a sales tax case. It basically only dealt with a US constitutional issue, but the rationale of the case completely supports source taxation of remote sellers. The structural pressures to do this come from the fact that physical activity is no longer a good proxy. The failure of the resident states now to tax through their exemptions of foreign direct investment means that there is an inducement for source countries to tax, or else you really don't have a fair system comparing your domestic industries with your cross-border industries. And finally, developing countries, as Michael said earlier, have to have an income tax, have to be able to collect that tax. Destination-based cash flow proposals in my judgment, don't make it for several reasons. One is they don't fix the income tax framework. They're really a transaction tax aggregated, and they don't tax the normal return to capital. That means rates have to be higher. That's one reason. The second is, and probably practical reason, is they're dead on arrival for at least a few years in the United States, so we can't really build a consensus around it. And that has everything to do with transition, which I'll come back to. So what is my proposal? I'm going to talk about 5 elements of what I think a proposal should be. And for the reasons I've said, I don't think they can have a digital-only focus. The 5 elements, if I can keep them on my screen in front of me, non-physical PE, the threshold issue. I think there's a fair amount of discussion that I don't think I need to spend time on as to what the threshold should be before the source country can tax. The $1 million issue, so to speak, or billions and billions of dollar issue is, what is the income that should be attributed to a non-physical permanent establishment? That is where all of the difficulty lies, and that starts, I'll come back to that in a moment, because that's really what the focus has to be. We need to avoid double taxation. We need to have an enforcement mechanism. I'm not going to talk about 2 critical elements of a proposal: dispute resolution, and most importantly, and what I think made the destination-based cash flow tax fail in the United States, thoughtful transition. How do you move from where we are today? How do we make sure the winners and losers are taken care of so that we evolve into a new world that we think is a better world, but in the meantime, we're trying to achieve the political objective that you have to achieve when you shift to a new system. So transition is critically important, and it's worth throwing dollars at it in order to get a new system if you think that's where you want to go. So the real issue, in my view, is where do we want to go, and how do we determine the income that should be attributable to a non-physical PE? First, I can't resist saying that taxing where value is created has about as much value as a Trump tweet. It's best to ignore it most of the time. The issue, we have an income tax, so the first question is, what are we investing? What are we investing in that is realizing value from the market? Every company I know invests in their market in some fashion or other. Pharmaceuticals are famous, or were famous, for their income statement having as much expenditure for marketing of their drugs as they did for R&D, the old-fashioned pharmaceuticals, the biologicals. And if you capitalize that intangible that's attributable to the market, whether it's a trademark, whether it's the software, the algorithm, or whatever it is that makes it attractive in the market, there is a very substantial investment in that. And what I'm arguing we should attribute to the market countries and then divide up among the countries who are the beneficiaries of it is the return to that investment. That is what keeps this idea, this approach, linked to traditional income tax principles. The big difference is we're no longer associating it with physical location, because we can't. Just as we really can't associate value with a normal return or an extraordinary return, because every company's normal return actually is different. It depends on their cost of capital, it depends on their marketplace. So this starts with company facts, capitalizes what the investment is, determines what the return should be to that investment. That should go to the marketplace, and it should be divided up based on sales unless there's a better metric. I'm open to everything as to metric, but that's critical. Now, the second thing that's never talked about, losses. If you're going to do that, does a market country accept the loss? They should, but we have never really fully allowed loss offset for a variety of reasons, because it tends to be manipulable. But I do think that before the market country should tax this return, it should be after the investor has recovered their losses, so recovered their expenditures, which is just an essential part of a system. We can talk a lot more about that. It can be developed. The other reason to want to go beyond digital is only a handful of digital companies are making money today. So if we're really trying to reallocate the allocation of income between countries, it needs to be apply to all companies, not just digital, both to get to the right answer, to handle losses. So that's item one. I have to talk about double taxation. If you're going to avoid double taxation, you have to make a decision. One decision is the residence country will credit the source country tax. That's one way of doing it, and that's fine. Or if you exempt the source country tax, you're exempting the income that's allocated to the source country, then you better disallow the expenses attributable to that income or you have a problem. Today's system overweights expenses to the residence country. Residence countries have been taking more than their share of expenses because of the way our rules have been structured. So this actually will have an improvement along that margin. Enforcement, B2B, you can either do withholding or you can do registration. If you're going to do B2C and you have to cover B2C, then you have to have a registration system, but we have mechanisms for that. And my 5 minutes are up. I'm calling it quits.
Okay, all right.
There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so second on this order is Andrew from Google.
Sure. Thanks very much.
Should be fine.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. And it's a pleasure to be here. So answering the question, where will we be in a couple of years? I think maybe a good place to start is just to take stock of where we are now. We've heard a bit about the two conversations, I think, that are happening at the moment. And John, I think right at the beginning, outlined some ways in which there's been a lot of change in the international tax landscape. Even from 2 years ago, we'd be having a different type of conversation. And so I think the conversation around double non-taxation is one which I think we've seen largely addressed particularly through BEPS, which has better allocated profit to value creation and created and encouraged companies to create structures that are more sensible and easy to understand. And secondly, through the influence of US tax reform, which has put an end to the idea of indefinite deferred taxation and introduced retrospective taxation of accumulated earnings and introduced a minimum tax on foreign earnings. So I think from this perspective, we are starting to move to a different place in the conversation. By way of parallel for some of those conversations around the amounts of tax that multinationals pay, if you look at our 10K reports, you'll see that Google over the last 10 years paid an average effective rate of 26%, which is above the OECD average tax rate. So I think the conversation, and certainly it's been reflected in the conversation we've had today, is very much moving to the question about allocation of profit and therefore of taxing rights between countries. And so where will we be? I can see two paths that have been outlined today, I think, by different people. And one is anchored by the milestone of the OECD report, and I've heard from a number of people from the OECD and elsewhere reasons to be optimistic on that front. And the second, of course, would be a world where you have a series of unilateral and heterogeneous measures undertaken by different countries on different sectors, of which digital would clearly be one. So where should we be? Well, ultimately, that's a question for governments. I don't want to overstep the mark, but I can sort of point maybe to a useful starting point from our perspective, which is this issue of the digital economy, and can it be ring-fenced? And this is something that the OECD and the EU experts group in 2014 looked at, and they concluded that no, it cannot be ring-fenced. And the reason for that was, I think, both based on principle and pragmatism. On principle, insofar as there's no qualitative difference between a service delivered digitally versus non-digitally, and pragmatic because any distinction about where you would draw the line on user preferences would be quite arbitrary. And so from a business perspective, we find that to be a fairly robust and sustainable conclusion that was made. I have some other remarks, but I think I might leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next up is Saibh from Lloyds.
Hi, thank you. So, firstly, I'm not here representing Lloyds, but I might use some Lloyds facts because they're the ones I remember. Thank you. And also, thanks to all the speakers today. I don't get out much, and I have definitely learned a lot about tech and taxation. So, as tax people, I think it's really important to remember that the first thing we generally do when we see consultations and tax laws. We just analyse it. We go straight to the detail and we analyse everything in front of us, and we try to work out if it applies to us. And I think that we tend to we lose sight sometimes of what we're trying to achieve. So in terms of where we should be, today we've heard a lot about value creation and profit attribution. So I think, our tax system is steeped in both of those concepts, and we should keep those at heart. But what I did before coming here is I had a quick look at some mission statements and some tax statements of companies that we will definitely recognise as tech companies. And I think they're quite good for the last debate of the day. So Facebook, we will give people power, we will build community, we're going to bring the world together. And in their tax statement is, we will pay the taxes that we're required to under law. And when I look at eBay and PayPal eBay, we measure our success by our customers' success. So it's actually, I think Ali is somewhere out there still. This is a different measure of success from earnings per share and share price. We empower people, we create economic opportunity, our purpose links us to something bigger than ourselves. And their tax statement is, we follow the rules and we pay all the tax we owe. And finally, I think Airbnb. So Airbnb uniquely leverages technology to economically empower millions of people around the world to unlock and monetize their spaces, passions and talents to become hospitality entrepreneurs. And when I look at the tax statement, it is in response to paying £200,000 of tax in 2016 on nearly 700 million of rental payments. The answer was, we follow the rules and we pay the tax we owe. So I think that, with some of those statements and tax statements, there's definitely a lot of world-changing activity going on, and there's definitely a lot of legally paying the tax we owe today. But I think that, if we try to see where we should go, I can't believe that users don't generate value. I have heard a lot today about IP, and I've logged on with 10 different IPs in a day. But certainly there must be some value, and there must be value creation from having access to an educated society, a society that has been created through education, health, law and order, which is ultimately paid for by tax. So, I'm not here trying to, preach to everybody, but if we get back to what we're trying to achieve, which is fair taxation of the digital economy, then, I do have to wonder why the fair tax rules applicable to the bank that I look after at the moment give me a £2.5 billion liability in the UK, but they give somebody else nil. So that's my opener.
Okay, thanks. That's actually quite a big tax bill. So finally, Michael.
Great. Well, where are we heading? Consensus 2020? I sort of doubt it. And if we did achieve it, I think so many important differences would be papered over, and the hearts and minds of so few of those involved would be coming along that you wouldn't get the sense of commitment. So it wouldn't necessarily be a loss not getting consensus in 2020, in my view. The idea of value creation, I think it's worth clinging on to because it's one of the few things that's generally agreed. Now, part of the reason for that is that we don't actually all agree what it means, but I think in sort of UN diplomatic terms, if you can find something you can agree on, then that's something to work with. And then maybe have some rules, some blunt instruments, some presumptions about what is value creation in a particular case. By not ring-fencing the highly digitalised industries, there's probably more at stake, because this is not really about taxation of the digitalised industry, it's about taxation of everything now. So it raises the issues of source versus residence taxation, which were too big to be dealt with in BEPS. And there's also a risk that you don't properly deal with the highly digitalised industries with their own aspects. I'm not saying that was the wrong decision. I think it was probably right to avoid ring fencing, but there are some implications. And I almost sense a little bit of deja vu about the discussion we never had on formulary apportionment, because we're talking about nexus, but then we're talking about allocation. And when talking about allocation, we're talking about sales approaches versus capital sales and payroll mixes, for example. From the UN perspective, the general view is that small countries wouldn't do real well in any formula that was sales-based. In the US, they've often gravitated to that, but that's because they don't want to tax. They want to get the value creation business without taxing it. So there are some issues in there. Where should we be going? And there's also a tension between, on the one hand, the fact that countries have a very broad right as to whether they tax on a source or residence basis, and often they tax on both, and then we try to reel them in through the double tax agreement system. So there's always going to be some unsatisfactory aspect of that. Where should we be going? I'm being a blunt Australian. I always believe in tackling head-on some of the differences, and I believe, for example, differences on the PE should be tackled head-on, even if there are different solutions in different countries, accompanied, as I mentioned earlier, with transparency. I always think, for example, that the diversion of profits tax is really a way of departing from the traditional ways of looking at a PE while actually pretending that you're really fully on board with the traditional approach towards a PE. That's my own view, and to me, that if that's true, that's not really what I want. So I think we hang on the value creation. We need some blunt instruments in there. There are already blunt instruments in the PE approach at the moment, and I'm never wedded to the idea of complete consensus as being necessary. As I say, I don't think you're going to achieve complete consensus, and I think the best that business can hope for is transparency about what's happening in a particular country, even if there are some differences between countries, and you try to narrow the differences and narrow the ways in which the differences are expressed between different countries. But finally, as I say, you need sufficient certainty both for the business but also for the revenue. Hard to do in a fast-changing area over such a period of time, but you do need to have the hearts and minds and some sort of sense of commitment from all participants. And going too fast, you might have this papered over consensus, which actually is not worth the paper it's written on. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the panel for the opening statements. We plan to go on for quite a while yet to give everybody a chance for questions, discussion, including kind of between panel members. There are clearly some issues which have come again and again through the day, like is it sensible to try and ring fence the digitalised economy? Is that a sensible thing? Do we want blunt instruments, as Michael's talking about, and is tax on revenue a blunt instrument? Can we actually implement a tax on revenue in the place where users are as opposed to where perhaps the advertiser is, and other issues like that? I was just thinking that we may even go to a vote before 5 o'clock as to kind of what people think in the room. But before we get to there, do any of you want to respond to each other, or should we just go to the floor? Anybody
just to say, a vote doesn't always end up with the right result.
Well, quite. I mean,
I'm thinking of a few things.
We know what the right result is. I just want to see if we persuaded people. I was just kind of picking up on your idea of consensus, really. I think we can demonstrate that there won't be a consensus, but we'll see. Maybe there will be. Let's go. So let's put it open for questions and comments. Who would like to start? Okay, let's take a couple. John would like to start, and then Judith in a sec.
Hi, so two issues which arose during the day seem the following. So one of them is, we heard from Michael that some countries have some resource constraints and capacity constraints, and we also heard from Brendan that it's hard for a small country to keep up. So I was wondering what the panel thought that a small country participating in the inclusive framework should do. I mean, it seems to me they can't, I'm not quite sure how easily they can participate in an effective and informed way. So what should they do if there is this political pressure to find some kind of solution? So that's the first thing. And the second issue which arose in a number of interventions during the day, is whether we should go for something pragmatic, even if it leads us to a system which is even more incoherent than the one we currently have. So there's clearly a very obvious benefit in reaching a pragmatic solution. But as an academic, I'm horrified by the thought that we're so happy to launch into even more incoherence than we currently have. So do the panelists see any dangers apart from academic neatness in moving to a system which is even more incoherent than the one that we have?
Okay, thanks. Can you leave the microphone just up there, about halfway up?
Thanks. Judith Knott. One issue that there's been some measure of consensus on over the day, it seems to me, is the question of the US tax changes. I think Andrew just now said that it would essentially deal with some of the issues that had been in multinational tax planning in the past, and that there was that view also came across from the panel of government experts this morning. And I was a little bit surprised to hear that, particularly perhaps on the government side, because it seems to me, without going into the detail of US tax reform, and which I haven't done, it seems to me that what those changes amount to is quite a disruptive influence on the international tax system. The previous US tax system had lots of faults, but what's happened seems to me to be fairly disruptive. And as an ex-tax collector, to my mind, disruption will only favour multinational tax planning. It's not going to favour international tax collectors and governments. And I just wondered what the panel's thoughts were on that, because it seemed to me we're perhaps being a bit too sanguine from a tax collector's point of view on the impact of US tax reform. And I don't think that's going to be something that's going to be apparent immediately. I think it will take years to come through, but I can't see governments being winners overall from that.
Okay, thank you. There's two hands up there. Can we take the one at the back first? Yeah, okay, thanks.
I'm George Turner from TaxWatch. It seems like a lot of the discussion today has been about dreaming up new ways to apportion the profits of multinationals to different jurisdictions for taxing rights. And I've never really understood why it's so impossible to do it by sales. I mean, we know what the business of Facebook is. Facebook is selling advertising. It makes their money from selling advertising. Google makes their money from selling advertising. And if you apportion profits on a sales basis in an advertising business, you would actually get to that whole discussion we were having before about the user base and what contribution it is, because for advertisers, their attractiveness, the attractiveness of the product being sold to them is dependent on the user base. We used to have newspapers, and newspapers were in the business of selling advertising. They weren't really in the business of selling newspapers. And advertisers would pay more to newspapers if they had a larger circulation. I don't know the details, but I think I can guarantee that the ad revenue for The Sun was probably always larger than the ad revenue for The Guardian for that reason. And so, if we have a simple way of dealing with these problems that is open to us, and why is there such a resistance to that kind of solution?
Okay, thanks. Can we come back to you and we'll just kind of answer those, well, give some answers to those questions first. So I think there are some questions there for all of us. The first question about resource constraints, Michael, do you want to have a go on that one?
Yeah, just briefly. Well, as a UN, we had a secretariat of 2, of which only one was tax qualified, so I know how they feel. And it's a very important issue. It's just impossible for a small country or a small UN secretariat to keep up with everything. So what we try to do is help them to focus on the particular issues to them, the impacts on their sovereignty and the pros and cons in terms of, on the one hand, the revenue, but also the investment climate, the effect on the investment climate of alternatives before them. We're encouraging them, and we don't have to because they do anyway, to work more regionally on these matters. ATAF in Africa, the African Tax Administrators Forum, has done a lot of good work in trying to coalesce an African position on a lot of these things, which led in part to country-by-country reporting, along with other factors. Also, we think one of the good things about the OECD work is, whatever you think about the level of involvement in the inclusive framework, in the BEPS work, is it gets developing countries at the table together. They get to learn more. And we believe there needs to be more cross-regional linkages where small countries in Africa and Asia might have the same interests, and they might be different from big countries in Africa and Asia. So those are some of the main things, and of course there's a duty upon the OECD and us to make sure that the real effects on economies are given attention to, so that they can form a fair decision on what works, and finally that they shouldn't be pressed to do things too quickly before they can assess them. That's been an issue in the BEPS. There's been a lot of countries felt that they were pushed, and this is not a criticism, that they were pushed by the political nature of the BEPS work and now this work, that they were pushed to get an agreement to do things which they really weren't sure what the impact was. So that has to be taken into account too.
Okay, thanks. We'll move on to the other questions, which are all quite general, I think. So there's John's second question about, do we prefer a pragmatic and incoherent tax system? Was the US tax reform disruptive, and should we apportion by sales? Saibh, do you want to pick up any or all of those?
I'll just pick a few. So, practical solution. Yes, I'm very practical, so I think that we need a practical solution. Will it be more incoherent? Yes, it always is, because we always layer tax on top of tax. So unless we rewrite the whole tax code, every time we change something, we'll have many people saying it's more complicated. But I do think we need to do something. It raises a new question, which is, if we have a solution, for whom is that solution? Because there are many stakeholders that you can tell even from the questions in the audience. So my stakeholders are the shareholders, the board, from a reputational point of view, it's NGOs, and actually the feedback is enormous. So in a quiet week for news, the Telegraph ran with a headline, Lloyds urges firms to pay fair taxes after stumping up 2.3 billion of tax to the Treasury. That wasn't actually my quote, but as I say, they went with it. And then I was drawn into the readers' comments, as you would be if you're the head of tax at that company. And they were very varied, which calls in the point about whose practical solution is it. So I was very interested that one person had commented that paying more tax than is required is inept. Somebody else say, others, another reader quoted from the well-known tax case of Lord Clyde versus Ayrshire Pullman Motor Services, which I wasn't that familiar with from 1929. But I think what it showed me is that there's many readers who think that paying a lot of tax, you're an idiot. And I don't think there's any government who believes that if they don't collect tax, they'll be able to run public services. So, in 1617, the UK needed, I think, about £720 billion to run the UK. And you can't get away from the fact that somebody has to pay the tax. So, if we find a practical solution which creates a fair tax system, then as a bank with a lot of digital users, maybe I should be a tech company instead and change my tax system.
Okay. Can I just push back a little bit on the complicatedness of it? I mean, is it inevitable that any tax reform makes things more complicated, or is that just what we've always had? Is it possible that we could actually make it better? Yeah, I mean, I don't think it is always complicated, but it's generally complicated for people who come to the table with a higher tax bill than they had before, I think. Okay. All right.
Mike?
Good. Can I get Andrew? Yeah, Andrew, do you want to say a few words on those things?
Sure, yeah. And firstly, in response to John's question, look, I think, again, this is for countries to decide insofar as countries would like to explore a changed approach to taxation in a digitalised economy, then, our hope would always be for a coherent framework that is agreed multilaterally. George, thank you for your question. And I think it comes down to kind of what specifically is the problem we're trying to solve here. And I think, there were two questions we've been talking a bit about today. My sense from the way the conversation has flowed today is that we're really focused, particularly post-BEPS, post-US tax reform, on the question of tax allocation. And I mentioned previously our own 10-year effective tax rate of 26%. Last year we paid $6.2 billion in tax. So I think there is the majority of that tax, of course, went to the United States because that is the structure under which we're operating. The same is true for a number of companies based here in Europe who have their headquarters here and large numbers of intangibles and R&D here. I think this is how the tax system operates. So the question now, I think, is, is this a moment to discuss allocation? And I think that's where the conversation is going. And I completely understand where that question comes from the perspective of allocation. But when we are looking at how do we allocate that profit, it's not clear to me that a new tax would be the answer to that particular problem.
Okay, thanks, Stephen.
I also want to come back to George's question, which I think is a good question. And as with so much else in tax, answers in one end or the other tend to have problems. So if you allocate all income to sales and you're an exporter, you pay no tax to your home country, right? You're saying, I'm allocating all the income according to sales to the countries I sell to, and if I only export, then I don't pay tax, and the person next to me performing exactly the same business but selling domestically pays some tax. It's just not. So we can't, and part of the reason for my suggestion is if we're going to move away from relying on physical presence, we're really saying, well, what portion of income, which is after expenses, should we give the other country a right to tax? That part can be on sales. I do think that's fairly simple. But I don't think it could be all income and then you ignore it. You have to do that difficult intermediate step. And the really hard question is, well, how do you take a company's income and you say what portion of it should be treated as, for the market country to have an entitlement to it? And I actually think we can come up with some reasonable metrics for that, having to do what is the investment that the company makes as part of its business to obtain those consumers, to keep those consumers happy, to provide user-specific benefits for consumers in that region. I think we can do that, but it's not easy. But it's, in my view, necessary because I don't think we can just take all of our income and do it solely on the basis of sales. With respect to the U.S. tax reform, it was disruptive. The disruption in the short term is primarily because of two things. A very dramatic reduction in the corporate tax rate that dominates every other aspect of the reform. We're talking about international here, but the dominant factor of that tax reform was going from a 35% corporate rate to a 21% corporate rate all at once, no transition, period, end of story. Now, that paid for business to accept an awful lot else, some of which is going to increase tax on some of what they do. The other disruptive piece, marginally disruptive only for a few financial markets, was the very low tax on new offshore earnings. Those will get sorted out over a number of years. It's been disruptive in some very modest financial holdings. That, again, in my view, was a huge benefit to business. But the international provisions, which I think are what we're thinking of as slightly disruptive, the provision which would tax anything over a 10% return to tangible capital currently, but at a very low rate of 10.5% or half the corporate rate, that actually has some very positive attributes. It's designed very poorly so that you can cross all your foreign tax credits, so some companies won't pay that at all, as was mentioned earlier today, or they'll pay a very small fraction. And it also is after this 10% return on tangible assets, which when you factor through all the other details of the U.S. reform, actually create or have the potential to create an incentive to put your next plant outside the United States, depending on the characteristics of the plant and how long its useful life is. That's just not smart policy. But it's all very, very specific. And that's disruptive principally because we're still figuring out how all these things interact and what they do. But it's not all bad, it's not all good.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to make myself part of the panel as well, I'm afraid, at this point. Just because Steve is making provocative comments, so I wanted to just give a slightly different answer to George. I mean, I'm not actually quite in favour of apportionment by sales either. But Steve's right. If you're apportioning, if you have a kind of formal apportionment system and it's all based on sales, then you can have two companies sitting next to each other, one of which exports, which pays tax in the foreign country, and one of which is domestic and pays tax at home. So they look as though they're being treated differently. A different way of looking at that is, you could look at, one country and say who's trying to sell in this market. If, in that case, they'll be paying different rates of tax in different markets that they're producing in. So you can have two companies competing with each other facing different tax rates. So the benefit of thinking about taxing in the place of sales is that those companies competing with each other, would be facing the same rate of tax. So it kind of depends which way you look at it and kind of where the kind of problems arise. I think a specific problem with the kind of form of apportionment using sales is that actually it's not quite so obvious that it's not manipulable. If I'm suppose I'm a retail company and I want to sell to UK consumers, I could actually, in principle, I could have some offshore company which kind of buys all the products in a tax haven and then kind of sell it back to myself, in the UK, kind of without any real profit. The people selling to me would then be kind of, if they're selling to me and we have a sales-based apportionment system, they'll be paying tax at the rate of tax in that tax haven. So I think we need to be careful about kind of thinking just kind of form of apportionment by sales is going to solve everything.
And can I just add on that,
again,
the
please?
developing country perspective, which is if you're a resource-rich developing country and most of your corporate tax is coming from multinationals that are exporting the resources, that are developing and exporting the resources, that unless you have a special rule for extractives, that's going to get you in a bad place. And most of the people who talk about formula apportionment acknowledge the need for a special rule for extractives, but the principle is the same.
Yeah, and I'm sure that Steve and I agree on much more than we disagree on. So let's go for more questions. So there's two up here now. Yeah.
My name is Dhiren Shah. I'm a tax consultant. I'm just going through the debate here and actually similar conferences last week. What's clear is that digitalised doesn't seem to be the right term for what we are actually talking about, because every business is digitalised in some way or the other. So if we start off with, we had an antivirus software company here, but you could have had a pharmaceutical company, because as I see it, there's absolutely no difference in what they do, right? They all use data. They come up with a product at the end. The only difference is one comes up with a software, the other one will come up with medicine. And the method of delivery may be different, but there's no... So it seems it's more about the business model. And there are certain business models that don't actually no longer fit into the traditional world. But even that, I think if you take the social media companies or search engines, as somebody pointed out, clearly they make their money from advertising. And that's no different from how newspapers made it. The only difference is the newspapers sold where the advertising related to. You get the social media and the search engine companies doing exactly the same, but the income doesn't flow where the advertising is actually created. And as I see it, this is the issue that is now being termed as value creation, but that seems to me to be the problem, is then sort of defining that as value creation, which actually goes with all the other stuff where there is value, and that doesn't seem to be right. So maybe it's something different. Maybe it's just what is being termed.
So you're seeing this as a kind of proposals for tax on social media companies rather than kind of the digitalised economy, and you're objecting to that, are you? I think.
No. What I'm saying is, I think it's more about terming it as digitalised, and the issue of tax on turnover, but it doesn't fit in every model. So what I think Will said was right, which is the laser-like analysis more of the social media companies. But what I'm saying is, well, it's clear that there is a different business model, and that's what's causing the issue. But in terms of, if you looked at a company which is in software industry or antivirus, it's no more tech company than a pharma company.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, thanks. Maya at the top. Thanks. Okay. And,
Got two hands over there, too.
Okay.
We did.
Okay, we've got what's
I think the difference between a pharma company and some of the platform companies that we're talking about, I think is not so much about whether they're digitalised within their business, but how much they change the value creation of others outside of their business. So a pharma company has, impacts on doctors and businesses in their supply chain, whereas Google, Facebook, eBay have impacts on all kinds of businesses across all kinds of economies, and the footprint of those companies in terms of the value they create is not in the profits of those companies. So Facebook makes, I think, $10 of profit per user per year. So, $2.50 of tax per user per year, and we're having a necessary debate about where that tax is allocated, but it's never going to cover the services that I, as a public service user, want and need. But on the other hand, the amount of, as Facebook users, the amount of value that it either creates or destroys in your life in terms of productive hours is much more than that. And if you're a business that advertises on Facebook, or a business that's disrupted by others that advertise on Facebook or Google, that's a huge impact on where value is created. So I think the significant thing about these businesses is that they disrupt location-specific rents in other companies, and it's location-specific rents that governments are able to tax. So, for example, a person in the Philippines, if they move to the US and they do exactly the same job that they were doing in the Philippines, they earn 3.5 times more. And that's part of why the US government collect more tax as a percentage of GDP than the Philippines government. And platform businesses erode, I think, that location-specific advantage, which is good for people in the Philippines. The winners and losers in terms of people in the US versus people in the Philippines, and then the winners and losers in terms of the taxes that can be collected. So I think, we're talking about taxing the digitalised economy. That means the whole of the economy, and these particular companies are the ones that have enabled that. So I wonder if by looking only at the taxes within that kind of $10 of Facebook tax, we're missing the bigger picture.
Okay, right, thanks. Further along, Mindy, Cindy, this way. Thanks. Mike. Who was that last question? Who was it?
I think it's a related question. Mike, you I think, drew an analogy between trying to find where value created is in digital and looking to the Bangladeshi factory making Nike shirts for 21 pence an hour. I think to suggest that it doesn't make sense to say that's where value is created, but isn't that what many countries are now trying to do, to say the ability to produce goods cheaply is a location savings that should allow them to be given more profits in even within the current transfer pricing model. And so related to that, there has been some discussion today about how what the real issue is, reallocating, the need to reallocate profits among different jurisdictions. So curious if anyone has an idea about which countries should be allocating more profits and which less profits.
Okay, so enough meaty questions.
You go first, Michael.
Michael.
Just the last one. I'll just make a very quick comment, which I remember once this issue was raised. Well, if it's so much more expensive to produce it in the UK, isn't there a location-specific advantage of X dollars to produce it in Bangladesh? And the answer is, well, what if it's actually cheaper to produce it in Vietnam or somewhere like that? How do you decide which two countries you're comparing? And I think there's some points in that. There's other aspects of location-specific advantages which are getting more and more sort of traction, including the, where there's a system of limiting luxury cars and so forth, which are allowed in a country. But the mere comparison of, and I'm not saying yes or no to it, but the mere comparison of the cost of producing in one country versus another country does become more difficult in a multilateral environment where there's so many different options, and some of them will even be cheaper than the one that's being produced. I just want to make one other question. No, I'll leave that for the moment. Okay. Steve, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just, one of the things I liked about Mike's example with the football player was, my guess is that the largest single amount of money was paid for the right to sell that equipment. And that really is a market intangible. And then if you said, well, how valuable was that UK kit in the rest of the world? I think Mike was right, not very valuable. And so you would end up having some apportionment based on how many of the kits were sold in France. And after you got over to the one UK person in France who bought it there, that's fine. And then the rest of it would end up in the UK. So the hard part to me, and here I do think, the example presents two things. Location savings, in terms of saving your cost of production by reason of being in Bangladesh. And then you've got some indication of a very valuable marketing intangible. Location savings, one of the problems with our current approach to transfer pricing, for which I thank Richard's book, if he's still here, for unpacking so much of this, is we try and cut everything up into these little pieces, and it just doesn't work well. The fact is there's a lot of profit that's generated. We don't really know whether it's location savings or attributable to marketing intangible, but we do have some metrics for trying to work that through, coming up with a best effort guess. Some of that should go to the market country. The UK should have the right to tax of it, and some of it should be taxed wherever that producer was producing. And that's what transfer pricing is. We do it all the time. It's not perfect, but the main point I'm making is not that we get away from transfer pricing, we can improve it. It's more, we now have to take a part of our overall profit and find a way based on a single taxpayer's facts and that taxpayer's profit to divide it between the market countries and the places of production and the rest of where the non-market activity is going, and give the market opportunities an effort to tax it. That has to be done on an relatively agreed multilateral basis so that we can agree to give a credit for that tax if it's imposed. And if it's not imposed, again, the big problem for exemption countries is they never allocate expenses appropriately to the income they've exempted. So they are almost always subsidizing non-residence country activity, which doesn't make sense to me.
So before going to can I just come back to you on that? Because the point of this analogy was actually to kind of then transfer what we think we know from the Bangladesh case to the digital economy case. What I thought the point of my analogy was to say, okay, there are also people writing Facebook pages who are a bit like the people in Bangladesh. Facebook has also got a brand name and like Google as well. How should we think about those different things when we're thinking about the digitalised economy? And does that give us a reason for having some new and additional tax in the digitalised economy? Do you want to answer that question as well?
Well, I'm not sure I'm asking exactly the way you asked it, but conceptually to me, the task is to say, what is it of the Facebook product that ultimately went to the customer in the market country that they were investing in that we really think of as relating to the marketing, as opposed to the same product that's available globally, that's the analogy to producing an aircraft engine, which I can sell around the world. The aircraft engine I sell around the world, the part of my cost and expenditure and investment that goes to that gets taxed by wherever that's being done, but the part that's attributable to Facebook really being successful in that market, being able to target customers, to be able to do the rest of it, that part of its expenditure is creating an asset that the return on which that country should have a right to tax.
Okay, so Andrew.
That was simple, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think I'm not,
Sure. Well, just maybe a couple of words on this concept of the user in value creation. Firstly, I think it's important to remember that whenever a customer interacts with a firm, it's very likely that they are providing information about their preferences to that firm. And that's true whether they're booking a holiday, whether you're buying a car, whether you are ordering fast food, whether you're using your supermarket loyalty points to buy shopping. It's increasingly the fact, in fact, I would say, because of the digitalization of the economy as a whole, that whenever customers are interacting with firms, they're providing information about their preferences, which are then used for product development. So if you do believe in the concept of the user and value creation, then I think you need to believe in it quite broadly. The second point, I think, is that, in fact, when it comes to search engine advertising, which is obviously our core business model, the role of user data in that is vastly overestimated. And if you think about it maybe for a moment about a typical search you might make, right, about what was the score in the England game, or where is the nearest pharmacy, or what's the best late night kebab in Oxford, which is Sid's Kitchen, by the way, you don't need to look it up. But if you think about a typical Google search, right, or a search engine search, you know, your question, the answer you're going to get is going to be overwhelmingly more related to the question you ask than anything specific about you, right? If you ask, where is the nearest pharmacy, to me, it doesn't matter who's asking that question, everything except from the location, right? So if you ask, what's the England score? Again, there's nothing particularly that is being created from value here to provide you with the answer about what the score in the England game is. So I think it's important just to note that when people do talk about advertising models in search engines, the role of user data, I think, is very often overestimated. The return you're going to get from your query is going to be overwhelmingly related to the particular question that you happen to ask, rather than anything specific about you.
So if I ask what the England score is, am I going to get an ad from Nike saying, would you like to buy this England kit?
Well, I think no, that's exactly the point, right? Which is that that's not particularly user information. That is information that's related to the search you're making. And so where's the value being created here? The value is being created by the billions of dollars of R&D and the tens of thousands of engineers who work on creating exactly the right user interface, exactly the right engineering, exactly the right systems, exactly the right algorithms to deliver the result for you that's going to be most relevant to your query. And that's where the value is created, as opposed to something is specific about you that is asking the question.
Okay, thanks. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, and where is the profit? Not location-wise, but the value is created through all the technologists. And the company makes money.
So the majority of our profit, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Yeah, no.
The majority of the revenue is paid in the US, over 80%. If you look at our annual reports, that's where the profit is paid.
And that's the advertising income by advertisers, is it?
Well, that's Alphabet's revenue in total, and a very large proportion of that is advertising income.
Yeah. So I asked that because I don't work for Google. But I come back to the concepts in tax of the value creation and the profit attribution again, which are probably need expanding. I think the idea of a separate tax for technology companies is probably not right, but expanding what we have so that it can actually apply to companies now, newer companies that actually aren't even that new anymore, but newer companies, because again we tend to see headlines and sound bites, and I don't know whose facts they are, but I know that somewhere it's quoted that I think in annual report that Facebook's second largest market is the UK. But I also just know from trying to understand some of the tax footprint of companies that, a few years ago, I think their tax bill was about £4,000. So I think that's really what fuels the debate around what's the right type of tax system, because the value creation, the attribution of profit and the keys that attribute that profit are just not really well understood. I think that's where, as a tax person, that's where I get confused. In terms of where the tax ends up being paid. So I think profit attribution and, again, value creation, we have heard a lot about the value creation of the technologists.
Just on the example we've just had, and I think this follows on from what Michael said, the question is fairly simple, but it shows you're interested in football, probably shows you're English or an Anglophile, And that's so you can understand why countries are saying, well, there's some value created there which will be used in terms of targeting the advertisement. So even though you didn't say much about yourself in giving the question, asking the question says something about yourself, which the argument is that creates value, which can then be used for and will be for the advertisements that follow.
Yeah, look, I think that the point I'm trying to make is that the value that is then created for a future response is probably a little less than people imagine.
Okay, let's go for. Okay, I can see lots of hands, so let's kind of expand it. So we'll start here. I've been reminding people to say who they are, but Martin, please say who you are.
Martin Hirson from the LSE. The question is quite short, which is the international politics of this, putting the technical stuff to one side, more difficult to solve than other issues that have preceded it? And if so, why? And if I can just add a quick speculation from something I've observed, which is people have been using the term market country quite a lot in place of source country in this discussion. And it seems to me the difference between a source country and a market country is that a source country both wants to tax the investment that comes in, but also wants to compete for it. Whereas the market country has the market power, the autonomy to be able to tax without fear that the investment or that the products coming in or the services coming in will leave precisely because the market is immobile. So I just wondered, if that is part of it, or if not, what it is that makes it difficult.
Okay, thanks. There's one just behind you, Pauline.
I'm Lawrence Peck. I have a question for Saibh. I want to make sure in my head I'm comparing apples with apples, and you've quoted the £2.3 billion that Lloyds has paid in tax, which is helpfully available, easily accessible if you do a Google search, Adam. So that 2.3 billion is comprised, kind of over half of it, is employers' NIC, irrecoverable VAT, and business rates. So were you saying that the tech company you were comparing Lloyds with that didn't pay any tax, were you saying it doesn't have any employees, doesn't pay any business rates, and doesn't have any irrecoverable VAT?
Just go with that, yeah. Yeah.
Shall I go
Yes,
with it?
yeah.
Yeah. My memory isn't very good. I'll go right away before we get more questions. So no, I'm glad you asked that because tax is obviously represented as tax charge, current tax, cash tax, deferred tax, total tax, and you're right. So the 2.3 billion that was quoted in the Telegraph was our total tax contribution. So it includes. I was quoting that on the Lloyds Bank website. Right. Okay. Yeah. Same number. So yes, it does. Consists of a number of taxes. What it doesn't consist of is taxes that we have collected on behalf of the government. So it is actually tax generated by Lloyds. So NICs is the employer's contribution. In terms of any comparisons with tech companies, that information just isn't, as easily available because the transparency rules are not the same. There's no CRD4 country-by-country reporting. OECD reporting isn't publicly available unless you wish to make it available. So no, you're not always comparing apples with apples. And usually when we do any of our research, it's for our own. It is for our own purpose, and we work on whatever is publicly available to have a look.
Okay, thanks. Let's get some more. We haven't forgotten Martin's question. We'll come back to that. This one here, Pauline.
Hello, I'm Helen Blenkinsop. I'm an interim tax person in-house. But the reason that I do interim work is because I spend half the year writing fiction as well. And in that capacity, I do advertise on Facebook, Google, and Amazon. And I just wanted to mention that, in my opinion, it is the user data, and it's what the user does that generates whether they see my advertisement or not. So, for example, on Google AdWords, I would advertise up against certain search terms. So I would say, if a user searches on a particular word, can they be shown my advertisement? I would bid to have my ad shown to them. On Facebook, similarly, I would be telling Facebook to show my advertisement to people who like particular things. So I'd be saying, if they like crime thrillers, if they like urban crime thrillers, if they like John Grisham, please show them an advertisement. And Amazon, similarly, I'd be going up against other people who are bidding for their ads to be shown in response to certain search terms. So you guys as users would go on to something like Amazon and you'd be searching for John Grisham or something, and I would hope that Amazon would say, well, if you like John Grisham, you might like blah-de-blah.
Oh, please advertise it. What would you like?
The pen name is A.A. Abbott, Fun, Fast, Crime Thrillers.
Okay.
But seriously, I did ask the question, and I wanted to raise it because I wasn't sure who else in the room actually knew how these ads work. And I don't understand the algorithms, but I do know very much that I am targeting my advertisements based on user behaviour.
Okay, thank you. The consumer.
That's the prosumer.
The prosumer. Okay. Okay, maybe I got the prosumer wrong. You can come back on that if you like. Let's pick up some more questions because there are quite a few. There's one up here. Yeah, it's coming along this way.
Alice Thomas again. I had a question. Well, not so much a question, more of an observation. The unique thing about the digital social media businesses and the search engines is that users use them because they are the best example of what they do. They do provide you with an answer you couldn't otherwise find. And there seems to be a sort of fundamental basic value that comes from that. Like, people, when MySpace was invented, went, oh, it would be nice online to be able to connect with my friends. And then they saw the Facebook interface and thought, that is a better version. That works a lot better. I know I can do what I want to do with it more. And when it introduces new features, it isn't usually because the users were clamoring for them. It's that somebody in the Facebook office thought, this would be a fun thing to do. And they try it, and the Facebook users use it and think, oh yeah, that does work. And the fact that they use it means it stays on the website, but if it doesn't, it gets taken down. So there is a good argument to be made that they are providing a service which has a value, and it was mentioned earlier that it's potentially a barter-to-barter value that purely comes from the user wanting to use the service because it works well and is efficient and increases their productivity, depending on how you use it. The compare the markets of the world, the other services that sort of bring things together. And there doesn't seem to be, when we talk about users contributing value to things, any recognition that the reason the users keep coming back to these services is because of what the technologists have done, which is to invent an interface that does exactly what they want it to do as quickly and productively as possible. And I think that might be what we're being told tech people are doing. You can tell me if I'm misrepresenting it.
Okay, can I have a quick look at how many other people want to answer questions? So let's, can the panel kind of have a quick go at those three, and then and give us time to kind of go back for more as well. So there's Martin's question about kind of are the technical issues more difficult here? Kind of Helen's useful comments about advertising in Google, and then this question about actually Google is the best search engine. Well, I paraphrase, because Google's sitting next to me, but it probably is. Do you want to start then?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but thank you. I think you put it far more eloquently than I did. In fact, in terms of the fact that, in fact, linking the two questions together, there is a degree of personalization when it comes to, for example, search engine advertising. But a huge amount of the value that is created above and beyond that is in relation to the engineers who are building products, testing products, trying, failing, trying again, investing, R&D to create something that is actually going to be valuable to users in the first place. And what is valuable to users is that when they ask a specific question, they get a result that is highly relevant to them. And how do we get to that point? There may be a user signal, but overwhelmingly, there is a huge amount of investment in engineering and in other services to get them to the point where the service is valuable to them. So thank you. You should be here instead. Yeah.
I'll take Martin's question.
Yeah.
So just coming back to Martin's question, whether the international politics are really how they're going to affect us and difficult. And I wasn't sure how to tie it into my use of the word more than anybody else of market, country versus source. But you may have cleverly caught me trying to position this from a political point of view to be more acceptable to a capital exporting country that is well known, that also is a major market, also known as the United States. The United States sometimes forgets that it's a market country as well as a capital exporter, but it has a very real role in this, and its relative ratio of foreign outbound FDI to inbound is gradually changing. The earlier information that was given about the largest tech companies, I'm not going to dispute that, but I also have looked up the largest internet companies, and of the top 10, 3 are Chinese: Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, at least by the marker of that Google search, pardon me. So our need to get our arms around this issue, I do think, is global. And I do think that we're just long past the time of revisiting the allocation of taxing rights between the major developed countries, which are exporters of capital, and the rest of the world, many of whom are market countries, but not exclusively. It's complicated. All of this requires a lot more work, and one of the most important things is whatever system we come up with, we need to model what are the income effects in terms of revenue effects, who's going to get the income, determine who the winners and losers are, and then we either say we like that outcome, it's an improvement, or we don't like that outcome, and if we like it but it's really difficult politically, then we're going to need to deal with transition and find a way to get to the compromise that makes the better system possible. Often that's transition. Often you manage those things through transition. And also with a projection. The U.S. in the future is probably going to have as much of a role as a market country as it does an exporting country.
Can I just have a quick follow-up on that? Yeah, it is complicated, and I think part of the trauma of BEPS is that some of the traditional capital exporters started to think, well, there are areas where we maybe need a bit more source state taxation. I actually think that's good because it makes it less a developed versus developing country issues. Then you've got countries like China and India, which traditionally have been very source country oriented, and no doubt there'll be some changes in how they're looking at some of these issues. I think it's actually healthy, but of course countries tend to look at a tax which they think they're missing out on. So it comes down to a pretty basic arithmetic at some stage. But I think that is an important aspect of the world we're living in at the moment, that traditional capital exporters are seeing themselves as capital importers in some respects. And I think that's particularly where they look and say, oh, large American company, foreigner, how do we deal with the taxation of that? And just to show my age, I used to use a program called Dogpile, where a little dog would actually dig for your results until that was superseded by a better search program. Some of you may remember Dogpile, probably not many.
No. Well, I know anyway. I would like...
the dog was good.
Can I just a very quick response to Martin on kind of source country? Personally, I'd like to ban the word source. Because it can mean so many different things. On the one hand, it kind of means, big developed countries versus developing countries, and on the other hand, it means, if you've got a PE here, I think people kind of conflate all of those in the same sentence quite often. So I think using the word source should be banned. So as of now, in the Centre for Business Taxation and Conferences, you're not allowed to use the word source. You have to be more precise. Okay, so more questions. One right at the very back. And any others? There were several others at some point.
I hope this is worth the wait. My name is Ben Stupples. I cover tax at Bloomberg, Bloomberg Tax, and I just had a question for Richard. If you're saying, Richard, thanks for your time today. If you're saying that the value user-generated user data is overestimated in a typical Google search, how much would you be affected by what the Commission outlined today to start off the day with the proposals for the 3% tax?
Okay.
So could you if that was aimed at me, could you repeat the question?
Do you mean Andrew, I think? Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I meant Andrew, sorry.
No problem.
If you're saying that the user-generated value is overestimated in a typical Google search, how much would you be affected by what the Commission is proposing for the revenue-based tax?
Okay, can you just hold on to that for a minute? We'll just hold on to that, collect a couple more. There's a question here in the middle. Thanks. A little bit further.
Good afternoon, Megha Kumar from Oxford Analytica. I think we need another conference to talk about emerging market tax policies. I think the issue has been sort of mentioned only marginally throughout the day. I do invite you to say something more about how China is handling this issue, not only because of its tech prowess all over the world, but also because its own artificial intelligence ambitions. Even if half of those are realized, then China's tax policy is going to be one of the most perhaps interesting, but certainly dynamic area. Are there lessons to be learned? Is it too unique? Are they ahead of the curve or not?
Okay, thanks. So, any last questions? No, there's one here. Okay.
Tom Ickeringgill from PwC. I just wanted to go back to one of Michael's points around whether consensus is needed, whether consensus is required, and whether it's appropriate for no consensus internationally, whether that is sustainable. I think that is a very valid point. The concern I have is if the US is not on board with any consensus, does this whole discussion become redundant? Does the US need to be a part of this consensus for any, for this to work?
Okay, I can't see any other hands shooting up. So, we've got three more questions. Do you want to start with the first question?
Sure, let me answer that, and I think it sort of speaks that last point as well. I can't speak directly to your question, but I can say that I think anyone, the overwhelming majority of people in the business community would want to see an agreement that is a coherent framework and is agreed multilaterally.
Okay. China? Who wants to take China? Steve or Michael?
Well, just to say that China always indicates that it's a unique market, and in many respects it is, but I think it is also in a unique position where it has seen itself not just economically but also in political terms as a leader of the developing countries, but also it's got so many multinationals. So I think it will struggle with where it lands, but I think it has found involvement in the G20 a useful way where it can influence global tax policy, even though it's not a member of the OECD and is in a different position to, say, a lot of UN countries.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to have anything? Yeah.
Well, the US, the question of whether it's essential, that often is not a black and white question of whether it goes along or not. The real first question is, will it kill any proposal? Which it has done in the past. And yet it did not kill BEPS. It just said, as certain parts of it were not participating, we think we do the equivalent. That's a perfectly acceptable outcome in a global, real world global environment. So there's a range of responses that you can have that don't require 100% consensus. Indeed, you never have 100% consensus. I want to come back to something I don't think we did justice to a comment by the lady in the back of the room, which was essentially the value that maybe that the users create that isn't linked to the income of Facebook is the way it was put. And I just want to unpack that a little bit. The discussion, the proposal I was talking about was about how do you tax the income of the taxpayer in question. And basically, under income tax principles, you can never, we typically do not want to tax more than the income, meaning revenue less expenses of the taxpayer. But if we do, and sometimes we do, it's really for different reasons. At that point, we're using the tax as a kind of a regulatory, either a regulatory tax or a tax to make up for a failure of the tax system in another respect. And that is a different kettle of fish. It's not clear to me that's exactly how digital has been rationalized, because it's sort of been said to be a tax that's essentially a replacement for our failure to tax income. But getting the answer to that question is really important in order to answer your question completely. And so I don't think any of us meant to disregard it. It's a very important question. Just my remarks were framed in context of taxing the income that's earned by a particular taxpayer.
Do you want to say anything?
I guess coming back to value creation, one of the points that I found interesting from the room actually is how there seem to be at least two very clear views. One is that users are targeted to create value, and the other one is that users receive an enhanced experience through the work of the technologists back at home, back in the US. And I think that, to me, that's just a really important point, considering US tax reform, taxing rights, attribution keys. And I think, looking at US tax reform, one point that hasn't been made today is that, cash is king. And so the US tax reform was quite brilliant in getting all of that overseas cash that previously didn't have to be paid to the US because it was clearly overseas income back to the US, because now it's clearly US income. So, a slightly different point, but I just think it's worth making that point in the context of the sort of split in the room between where is the value created, is the user targeted to create value and, advertising on the back, or is the user targeted just to enhance that user's experience, which is value created in the home country.
Okay, thank you.
Very, very briefly, if any one country doesn't stop even if it's possible for it to stop a multilateral consensus of some sort or something approaching that, then if it doesn't stop it, it's almost inevitably in the interest of its companies that have been engaged in the process. So I think whatever happens, if as this work proceeds, the voice will come from the companies that there should be involvement to try and get a result that works for them. So there'll always be some US involvement in these things, even if not so obviously.
Okay, thanks. We're going to stop there. But before we stop, kind of mainly for the benefit of my own curiosity, we've actually had quite a lot of different views reflected during the course of the day. Kind of pro or anti-value value creation, whether we should ring fence the digital economy or digitalised economy, whether we should have an interim solution based on revenue. And I'm kind of curious as to know who's kind of won the argument in the room, which is clearly, not binding on anybody else. But I quite like to ask a question of everybody and kind of see whether there is a consensus in the room on any of these issues. So can we have a quick show of hands on those things? Is everybody up for that before you? I should say, actually, the other thing I should announce is that as soon as we've done this, there are drinks outside. But you don't get a drink until you've done this vote. So so the first question would be, is it sensible to think about ring-fencing the digitalised economy for any form of tax? Is ring-fencing the digitalised economy a kind of reasonable approach for taxation? If you think it is, please put your hand up. Okay, and if you think it's not, okay, right, I think that's pretty overwhelming. Okay, so I suppose we were to ring-fence the digital economy nevertheless. Would an interim tax based on revenues in the place of the user, is that a good idea? If you're in favour, yes, put your hand up. And if you're against, okay, that's pretty overwhelming as well. I should say, in the room here we have people from all backgrounds within tax. We have, academics, we have students, we have people from business, we have people from professional firms, we have people from government. So this is and people from NGOs and all over. So this is kind of fairly representative. Can I ask one more question, just for my own curiosity? Then I'll let you get a drink. Which is, is thinking about where value is created a good basis for taxing either digitalised economy or indeed anything else? If you think it is, put your hand up. Okay, and if you think it's not, Okay, that's much more even. Okay, so let's go and argue about that over a drink. Let me thank you very much. I would just like to, yeah. Okay, so second on this order is Andrew from Google.
Sure. Thanks very much.
This should be fine.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. And it's a pleasure to be here. So answering the question, where will we be in a couple of years? I think maybe a good place to start is just to take stock of where we are now. We've heard a bit about the two conversations, I think, that are happening at the moment. And John, I think right at the beginning, outlined some ways in which there's been a lot of change in the international tax landscape. Even from 2 years ago, we'd be having a different type of conversation. And so I think the conversation around double non-taxation is one which I think we've seen largely addressed particularly through BEPS, which has better allocated profit to value creation and created and encouraged companies to create structures that are more sensible and easy to understand. And secondly, through the influence of US tax reform, which has put an end to the idea of indefinite deferred taxation and introduced retrospective taxation of accumulated earnings and introduced a minimum tax on foreign earnings. So I think from this perspective, we are starting to move to a different place in the conversation. By way of parallel for some of those conversations around the amounts of tax that multinationals pay, if you look at our 10K reports, you'll see that Google over the last 10 years paid an average effective rate of 26%, which is above the OECD average tax rate. So I think the conversation, and certainly it's been reflected in the conversation we've had today, is very much moving to the question about allocation of profit and therefore of taxing rights between countries. And so where will we be? I can see two paths that have been outlined today, I think, by different people. And one is anchored by the milestone of the OECD report, and I've heard from a number of people from the OECD and elsewhere reasons to be optimistic on that front. And the second, of course, would be a world where you have a series of unilateral and heterogeneous measures undertaken by different countries on different sectors, of which digital would clearly be one. So where should we be? Well, ultimately, that's a question for governments. I don't want to overstep the mark, but I can sort of point maybe to a useful starting point from our perspective, which is this issue of the digital economy, and can it be ring-fenced? And this is something that the OECD and the EU experts group in 2014 looked at, and they concluded that no, it cannot be ring-fenced. And the reason for that was, I think, both based on principle and pragmatism. On principle, insofar as there's no qualitative difference between a service delivered digitally versus non-digitally, and pragmatic because any distinction about where you would draw the line on user preferences would be quite arbitrary. And so from a business perspective, we find that to be a fairly robust and sustainable conclusion that was made. I have some other remarks, but I think I might leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.